Over 500 years ago, political ideas filtered across the seas. In the great galleons between Acapulco and Manila. Ultimately, in the Philippines, a national consciousness and identity evolved, and an assembly of the representatives of the people emerged from the 1896 revolution. Negotiations between the Filipino revolutionaries and the Spanish colonial authorities resulted in the Pact of Biak na Bato, ratified in December of 1897 by a preliminary convocation, and meant to stand for the Assembly of Representatives of the Filipino nation, convened by the President of the Revolutionary Government, General Emilio Aguinaldo. In 1898, the Asamblea Consultiva de Filipinas became the first official institution representing the Filipino people in the nation's history. When Manila was ceded by Spain to the United States in December 10, 1898, Aguinaldo established a formal seat of power in Malolos and convened the Revolutionary Congress, or the Assembly of Representatives, later known as the Malolos Congress. Aguinaldo declared that the Church of Baraswain, once the sanctuary of mystic rites, is now the august and stately temple of the dogmas of our independence. The Philippine-American War began in 1899. Then came the fall of Malolos. The Americans captured Aguinaldo and Palanan Isabela on March 23, 1901. Less than a month later, the Republic was dissolved.
Speaker Sergio Osmeña called the First Philippine Assembly the child of the Philippine Revolution.
The centenary that followed witnessed the House of Representatives exercise its crucial role in nation building. This institution provides the venue where the people's views and needs are articulated, where responsive laws are enacted to benefit the citizenry, where the House or Assembly members preserve and promote the common interests rather than parochial concerns, while tempering their political liberty with social responsibility. The legislative mill produced laws that address priority sectoral concerns. Education is always one of the first items in the country's legislative agenda. During the Philippine Assembly of 1907 to 1916, Speaker Osmeña led the legislation of schools in the barrios, or the Gabaldon Law, the precursors of today's National Library and University of the Philippines were also established. Later on, during Diosdado Macapagal's presidency, the House of Representatives established many new schools and agricultural colleges. Free public high school education was provided for during Mitra's speakership. The creation of the Commission on Higher Education was an achievement of the Fifth Republic's legislature under Speaker de Venecia, who also personally drew up the 800 million Study Now, Pay Later plan for science and technology scholars nationwide. The highlight of the 9th Philippine legislature was the enactment of the law on women's suffrage in 1933. Later on, the question of granting women the right to vote was again addressed by the First National Assembly of the Commonwealth. A plebiscite was won for women's suffrage. Elisa Ochoa became the first woman legislator.
The Tidings-McDuffie Law was the final step towards achieving complete independence of the Philippines.
Under Manuel L. Quezon's presidency, the First National Assembly of the Commonwealth was born. The first Commonwealth law, the National Defense Act, led to the creation of the Department of National Defense. Agrarian reform was initiated in 1936. Commonwealth Act No. 20 authorized the President to order expropriation proceedings for the purpose of acquiring portions of large landed estates used as home sites and reselling them to their bona fide occupants. President Magsaysay's term saw a land reform law passed in 1955, the first in the country's history. Diosdado Macapagal's era saw the enactment of the Agricultural Land Reform Code to address the problem of agricultural share tenancy. The code made tenants on privately owned lands the owner cultivators and enabled landless farmers to acquire government land. President Aquino's centerpiece program was Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or CAR. This program widened the coverage of land transfer from rice and corn lands to agricultural lands of all kinds, including fish ponds, about 5 hectares. The law which had the most impact on Filipinos was the abolition of cedula or poll tax. This tax was a symbol of Spanish colonial rule and was one of the leading causes of the Philippine Revolution in 1896, where many Filipino revolutionaries proclaimed their rising against Spain by tearing their cedula.
Punitin ninyo inyong mga sedula at magkaisa tayo sa himagsikan! Mabuhay ang Pilipinas! Mabuhay ang katipunan!
President Quezon argued that this tax was a burden to the poor. On January 2, 1942, Japanese imperial forces took over Manila during the Second World War. They immediately declared the establishment of a Japanese military administration to replace the Commonwealth of the Philippines.
Fire on the litter bearers!
The Japanese promised independence to the Philippines and allowed elections. Jose P. Laurel was elected president. On October 14, 1943, independence was proclaimed. The Philippine flag was raised, flying alone in all parts of the country. The National Assembly of the Second Philippine Republic created new government bodies, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Food Administration, and the Patent Office. The Japanese-sponsored government did not last long. On September 21, 1944, American forces, redeeming General MacArthur's promise, returned to liberate the Philippines from Japan.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return.
As the war came to an end, Manuel Rojas was elected as the last president of the Commonwealth and the first president of the Third Republic.
In 1945, laws for the rehabilitation of the war-torn country, such as the participation of the restored Commonwealth in the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later to be known as the World Bank, were enacted by Congress. The Central Bank Bill of the Third Republic, which aimed to maintain monetary stability within the country and to preserve the international stability of the peso, was passed and signed into law by the President. In the period 1992 to 1995, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas was established with expanded powers to boost a growing economy. Rural banking was liberalized by Congress in 1952, giving rise to the organization of almost 100 private rural banks. The Artisan Wells Act of 1955 provided water for every barrio, as President Ramon Magsaysay promised.
Ferdinand Marcos, the elected president in 1965, declared martial law in 1972.
proclaimed martial law in accordance with the powers vested in the President.
Marcos issued Amendment Number 6, which gave him decree-making powers, even if the legislature existed or not, and was in session or not. The first amendment to the 1973 Constitution was the changing of the name of the legislative body from the National Assembly to the Batasang Pambansa, otherwise known as simply the Batasang. The interim Batasang Pambansa convened on Independence Day, June 12, 1978. In a visible break with the past, it convened not at the old neoclassical legislative building in Manila, but at a brand new and highly modern Batasang Pambansa building in Quezon City. In 1972, President Marcos declared the entire country as a land reform area, and through PD number 27, restricted land reform scope to tenanted rice and corn lands and set retention limit to 7 hectares. Under Masagana 99 rice production program, farmers were provided accessible credit, the establishment of export processing zones, the first of which is the Bataan Export Processing Zone, also helped boost the country's industrial output. Martial law was eventually lifted in 1981. The triumph of the People Power revolt at EDSA thrust Cory Aquino to power. She took her oath of office as Revolutionary President on February 26, 1986.
As President of the Philippines.
As President of the Philippines.
The Batasang Pambansa was abolished under the Freedom Constitution. A year later, a new constitution took effect, created the present House of Representatives and the Senate of the 8th Congress. Ramon V. Mitra Jr. became the House Speaker. In a speech delivered upon his election to the speakership, Mitra declared that we cannot afford to squander this second chance, which history has given us to prove that we can temper political liberty with social responsibility.
The new Congress ushered in controversial but very significant pieces of legislation. Mitra steered the enactment of milestone laws.
The Generics Act of 1988 ensures the adequate supply of drugs with generic names at the lowest possible cost, and that these are made available at no cost to indigent patients. The Compensation and Position Classification Act of 1989, popularly known as the Salary Standardization Law, raised the compensation of government employees. A piece of key legislation was the 1991 Local Government Code that devolved powers and functions and responsibilities to local government units and broadened the scope of local autonomy.
During Fidel V. Ramos's presidency, Speaker Jose de Venecia provided the leadership and reform agenda in the 9th and 10th Congresses that passed reform legislation that created the Philippine economic miracle.
For economic stability, Speaker de Venecia's Basis Conversion and Development Act of 1992 provided for the distribution of proceeds from the sale of portions of military camps. The proceeds helped to develop Clark and Subic, former bases for U.S. military forces, into thriving economic zones. It also paved the way for the development of Fort Bonifacio into a glittering new city. The Magna Carta for Overseas Filipino Workers evolved into Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipino Act of 1995. The Act prescribed greater protection for migrant workers, now about 8 million overseas, remitting $10 to $12 billion annually. The Philippine National Police was established out of the old Philippine Constabulary. A new value-added tax replaced 73 taxes. The VAT was later restructured in the 13th Congress. The Social Security system coverage was expanded. The penalties for illegal possession of firearms were strengthened. In agriculture, a law was passed in 1995 to promote the production, processing, marketing, and distribution of high-value crops. The Oil Industry Deregulation Law of 1996 provides fair prices and guarantees the continuous supply of environmentally clean and quality petroleum products. Financial reforms help the government to maintain budget surpluses during the Ramos period.